Okay, welcome to the sixth session of the Great Decisions, session of the Great Decisions program uh, on NATO and the future of NATO. Um, the speaker we have this evening is Professor Eliot Cohen. And with that, I'm going to let Dan Foote, one of our board members, do the introduction to Professor Cohen.
Thank you, Ray, and good evening, everybody. I am so pleased to introduce Professor Eliot Cohen this evening. You may have kids who are fans of Taylor Swift. I am a fan of Eliot Cohen, and I've been watching his podcast for months now, and I'm going to give you all some more information about that later in my remarks. Professor Cohen is the Arleigh Burke Chair of Strategy at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and Professor Emeritus of Strategy at Johns Hopkins. He is also, as I mentioned, a noted podcaster and writer. Professor Cohen received his BA in government in 1977 and a PhD in political science in 1982, both from Harvard University. During his PhD training, he participated in the Army ROTC program at MIT and later served as a military intelligence officer in the Army Reserve, leaving the service as a captain. Following that, he served as a professor of government and assistant dean at Harvard from 1982 to 85, then joined the faculty at Naval War College as a part of the Department of Strategy before serving in 1990 on the policy planning staff in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. In 1990, Professor Cohen began teaching at SACE, of course, at Johns Hopkins. And following the 1991 Persian Gulf War, he directed the U.S. Air Force's Gulf War Air Power Survey, for which he received the Air Force's Exemplary Civilian Service Award. He went on to serve as a counselor in the Department of State under Secretary Condoleezza Rice, directed the Strategic Studies program at Johns Hopkins School of International Studies, and in 2019 was named the dean at SACE. He's also been a member of the Defense Policy Board Advisory Committee, a collection of civilians and retired military officers that the U.S. Secretary of Defense instituted during the second Bush administration. Seems like not that long ago, but in 2014, when things started to cook in Crimea, Professor Cohen wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post at around the time of the ousting of President Yanukovych and the annexation of Crimea, and wrote about his concerns that President Putin at the time was a Russian nationalist who believed that Russia without a belt of subservient states would be weak and vulnerable to the same kind of upheaval that toppled the president of Ukraine. Moving forward, we would know what happened in Ukraine, but in 2020, Cohen and 130 other former Republican officials, former national security officials, signed a statement essentially opposing a second term for President Trump. I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about that. As I noted earlier, he's a noted podcaster. You may be familiar with the famous Bulwark collection of podcasts. There are speakers in that group, such as Sarah Longwell, who does focus groups, of course, Bill Kristol, former GOP chair Michael Steele, and of course, Eliot Cohen and his partner in strategy, Eric Edelman. The Shield of the Republic podcast is a national security and foreign affairs podcast co-sponsored by the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. Most recently, Eliot and Professor Edelman addressed the meeting between President Trump, Vice President Vance, and President Zelensky. That podcast, I believe, has clocked approximately 625,000 views as of earlier today. I also wanted to note in our briefing book, which hopefully you all purchased, this one here, the article on NATO was authored by Kori Schake, who's a friend of Professor Cohen's. And on January 19th, 2025, the podcast hosted Kori Schake in a discussion that kind of went over the ups and downs of foreign policy during the Biden administration. Went on a little longer with that, but his career is distinguished, and I wanted to give you a full background. With that, Professor Cohen, the floor is yours. I think Professor Shake's article sets a nice historical stage about NATO, and I would say this. I had thought over the past 10 or 14 or 15 years that NATO was just kind of always there, that it was stable, that it was protecting Europe, and that we were all getting along just fine. I think the article goes into just how difficult that relationship has been since the founding of NATO. It's always been a little bit fractious, and there's always been debate over burden sharing and responsibility. And of course, that led to arguments following the Cold War that NATO was obsolete. And of course, now we have the Trump administration. So we'd like to hear your thoughts on NATO, but also the future of European security, as well as the broader topic, perhaps, of the future of liberal democracy, both in the US and Europe. Thank you so much for agreeing to address our group tonight, Professor Cohen.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dan. Thanks for that warm introduction. And let me just say how glad I am to be with one of the World Affairs Councils. I've spoken to many of them around the country. I think they're a really important organization. It's really important that we have Americans across this country who take a keen interest in international affairs. And that's probably going to be more important than ever going ahead. So I thought I'd begin with about 20 minutes or so of remarks and the way it builds on some of the things in my friend Corey Shockey's article, acknowledging that history. But I want to just begin by saying how much our world seems unmoored when you have a president who denounces not only individual European allies, but NATO in its entirety, who questions our commitments under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty to come to the aid of a NATO member who's attacked, who's expressed friendship for a particularly predatory and brutal Russian regime, who's actually threatened to invade two NATO members, Denmark and Canada, and annex them, and most recently who was in the Oval Office abusing a dependent European state, which is really fighting for its life against a brutal invasion. We have not seen anything like this before. And I think this is not, it is not like one of the periodic crises that we've had. And that's why we get speeches like the one by Senator Claude Malhuret, a French senator, a longstanding Atlanticist, a conservative, and a friend of the United States. And at the beginning of this month, he gave a speech which included these lines. My dear colleagues, Europe is at a critical turning point in its history. The American shield is crumbling. Ukraine risks being abandoned, Russia strengthened. Washington has become the court of Nero, a fiery emperor, submissive courtiers, and a ketamine-fueled jester in charge of purging the civil service. We were at war with a dictator. Now we are fighting a dictator backed by a traitor. 8 days ago, at the very moment that Trump was rubbing Macron's back in the White House, the United States voted at the UN with Russia and North Korea against the Europeans, demanding the withdrawal of Russian troops. 2 days later in the Oval Office, the military service shirker was giving war hero Zelensky lessons in morality and strategy before dismissing him like a groom, ordering him to submit or resign. Tonight, he took another step into infamy by stopping the delivery of weapons that had been promised. What to do in the face of this betrayal? The answer is simple: face it. Those are brutal words, but I think it's very important to understand that whether you agree with them or not, they represent the views not of the extreme left or the extreme right in Europe, but the center. I recently had dinner with an old friend of mine, a very senior figure in the national security establishment of a European country that takes security very, very seriously. He is a very tough and normally rather reserved individual. He's also, I would say, a moderate conservative who loves this country, who is educated here, and who has fluent English and familiarity with American culture. And this is what he said to me. When I watched that scene in the Oval Office between Trump and Zelensky, I began crying. This really is a crisis moment, and that's what I'd like to discuss with you. One cannot avoid discussing President Trump, of course, but I would like to broaden the discussion out by considering him first as a cause of the current rupture, then as a catalyst for certain developments that have led to it, and finally as the symptom of some much deeper forces. So let's begin with Trump as a cause. Trump is a unique political figure in so many ways. When we get past these times, which will have to be about a decade or two after he passes from the scene, people will have to assess, will really only be able to begin assessing where he came from and why he was able to succeed as he did. There are a number of points about President Trump's outlook that make him qualitatively different from any previous president in his attitude towards NATO, let alone anything else. First, he evinces no, and I mean no regard for the liberal democratic values that currently underlie the transatlantic alliance. In a moment, I will discuss how that alliance itself is quite different from what it was in the past. Still, in the last half century, the democratic basis of NATO has been absolutely critical and essential to its identity. He is overwhelmingly focused on hemispheric issues. His comments about annexing Greenland, bringing Canada into the Union, and seizing the Panama Canal, and his desire to invest in the physical defense of the Western Hemisphere fit the picture of what's actually a very traditional kind of American geopolitical outlook. He does not see Russia as a threat, just the reverse. His vision of international affairs is one of great powers in conflict who occasionally cut deals with one another, a very transactional view. He has no use for traditional diplomacy or traditional diplomats. And this last is actually a very important point because there's actually a reason that states have tended to give the job of representing themselves abroad and conducting negotiations to very experienced professionals or those from related fields with a great deal of relevant experience. Think of Henry Kissinger, for example. Finally, he does not, in general, value or seem to understand alliances. Rather, he has an intensely transactional view of alliance relationships. By contrast, the traditional view, which I share, is that the development of deeply rooted, thoroughly institutionalized, and generally, not entirely, value-based alliances is one of America's greatest strengths. So that's Trump as cause. But Trump is also a catalyst. Henry Kissinger put it this way in an interview in the Financial Times in 2018. He said, "I think Trump may be one of those figures in history who appears from time to mark the end of an era and to force it to give up its old pretenses. It doesn't necessarily mean that he knows this or that he is considering any great alternative. It could just be an accident." I knew Henry Kissinger quite well, and I don't think this was a casual aside. And I do think that it's an extremely acute observation. NATO has evolved into something quite different from the alliance that many of us remember and took part in, certainly something entirely different from what was envisioned in the 1949 North Atlantic Treaty. It's worth remembering what went into that treaty. That treaty had only 12 members. Today, NATO has almost 3 times as many. NATO, as originally constituted, had no Supreme Allied Commander, no standing command structures, and no American forces permanently stationed on the continent. The largest European power, Germany, was still divided, disarmed, and occupied, and most emphatically not a member of NATO. Nor was the alliance entirely democratic. One of NATO's founding members, Portugal, was a dictatorship. Over time, and particularly after the end of the Soviet Union, NATO lost much of its sense of meaning and purpose. Many, by no means all, of our European partners effectively disarmed, and its focus was abroad. The political underpinnings remained, which is why the only time Article 5, an attack against one is an attack against all, was invoked was by our allies after the United States was attacked on September 11th, 2001. It is why 250 Danes and 750 Frenchmen were killed and wounded fighting side by side with us in Afghanistan. But the military strength of NATO atrophied, and its members became dependent on the United States. Many countries, including even France, eliminated conscription. Germany in particular let its capacity slide to the point that it was effectively unable to deploy more than a brigade or 2 into combat. Even Britain now has an army smaller than at any time since the Victorian era, and indeed for most of that. The result was brewing resentment in the United States, particularly as Europeans refused to heed calls to bear their share of the military burden and cut lucrative and dangerous deals, particularly for hydrocarbons, with Russia. Consider the words of the Secretary of Defense. The blunt reality is that there will be dwindling appetite and patience in the United States Congress and in the American body politic writ large to expend increasingly precious funds on behalf of nations that are apparently unwilling to devote the necessary resources or make the necessary changes to be serious and capable partners in their own defense. Nations apparently willing and eager for American taxpayers to assume the growing security burden left by reductions in European defense budgets. Indeed, if current trends in the decline of European defense capabilities are not halted and reversed, future U.S. political leaders may not consider the return on America's investment in NATO worth the cost. Now, the Secretary of Defense who spoke those words was not Secretary of Defense Peter Hegseth, but rather Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, who was the Secretary of Defense both for Barack Obama and George W. Bush over 14 years ago. And he was very, very far from being the first American official to speak in this vein. Russia was not mentioned in the original North Atlantic Treaty, but that treaty was most definitely designed to protect Europe and the United States against the Soviet Union and communism. As a successor state, Russia was 3/4 the physical size of the USSR, with not much more than half of its population. It looked, and for a long time was weak. Its aspirations seemed chiefly European. For a lot of Americans, that meant that Europe should be able to manage on its own, dealing with a European security problem rather than the global threat of communism. They were not entirely right, because Europe had become accustomed, perhaps too accustomed, to acting only with American leadership. But a lot of Americans believed that the United States had done its fair share by rescuing Europe from three threats during the 20th century: nationalism, fascism, and communism, all of which were entirely homegrown. 3 attempts at European suicide, if we care to think of it that way. That view of history and the undeniable reality of the shift of American concerns, economic and security interests to the Indo-Pacific and the challenge of a rising China gave Trump an opening. He is, in some respects, merely saying in extreme form what many Americans have long thought. And in foreign, as in domestic policy, that turns out to be a powerful thing. There is finally Trump as symptom. Trump is a symptom of the profound changes in Western and social political life in recent decades. Merely to list some of the crucial developments of the last 20 years is enough to make one's head spin. The 2008 financial crisis, the explosion of social media, the death of legacy media, COVID, the collapse of traditional manufacturing employment, the early effects of climate change, the dramatic rise of China, attitudes towards gender, family, and identity way out of historical norms, and more have disrupted our politics. Artificial intelligence will do and is doing even more as it destroys many jobs, even while it opens up new possibilities in all areas of human endeavor. Deeper yet is discontent with contemporary American and more broadly Western elites. We saw this in a somewhat muted way in Britain's exit from the European Union, but it is very pronounced here as well. All societies have elites. That's just a fact of political sociology. But elites are legitimate insofar as they contribute value to society, embody virtues that others respect or admire, and are open to new entrants. It is why some elites last a very long time. And as an example, I always think of the Yankees of New England, where I grew up. And to be very clear, I am the grandson of immigrants to that part of the world. But elites no longer seem to contribute value. If they contribute to or even benefit from events like the 2008 financial crisis, or if they concoct schemes to cope with COVID that end up damaging people who did not have the financial and social resources to school children at home. They are increasingly not the ones who serve on the front lines of the armed forces or in other ways sacrifice for the public good. And as we now know, without intending it perhaps, they've become harder to join because grooming for success begins in kindergarten and continues remorselessly through graduate school. The great sort, as some have called it, between urban and rural, rich and poor, highly educated and less so, has bred profound mistrust. And Trump got reelected by pounding away at those divides. He is, in a way, a symptom of a populist revolt that is occurring throughout the Western world. It is a revolt that is weakening many of the traditional guardians and gatekeepers of liberal democracy. When I grew up, there were three main television networks plus public television, and they helped limit the kinds of conspiracy theories and wild ideas which have always existed and always will. It is possible today to immure oneself in a stew of hatred, suspicion, and lunatic beliefs, no matter where you are in the political spectrum, without any possibility of contradiction. And because our educational system has largely failed to teach history and civics, there are fewer self-imposed limits to how far down such holes people are willing to go. Moreover, the new social media in particular, and the culture they've helped shape, have undermined many of the norms of civility, mutual respect, reverence for process and institutions, which, as Alexis de Tocqueville noted back in the 1830s, are as important to freedom as much as they are to systems of law. At its best, this populist revolt may refresh our democracy. At its worst, it may do immense damage to individuals and to destroy the institutions, beliefs, and practices that keep us free. It may very well do some of both. I know that it is already doing a lot of the damage that many of us feared. And one consequence of it has had the effect of undermining our support for other liberal democracies abroad, and particularly NATO. Vice President Vance's recent speech at the recent Munich Security Conference was churlish. There was no mention of the alliance, of Russian imperialism and barbarity. It was insulting and it was disrespectful. But it unquestionably tapped the antipathy that many of America's populists feel towards a democratic culture in Europe that really is very different from our own, and inevitably so. So let me conclude. Some time ago, I wrote the following. The greatest danger to the alliance arises from the psychological relationship between the United States and an old world dependent for its very survival on the arms of the new. As Raymond Aron has said, by its very nature, Western Europe's dependence on the United States for its own defense is unhealthy. Once Europe had recovered from the devastation of World War II, let us say for the sake of convenience, by 1960, the relationship of protector and protected was likely to evoke arrogance and condescension from the one side, resentment and irresponsibility from the other. Now, when I say that I wrote that some time ago, it was really some time ago. That was from my very first article in Foreign Affairs, published in 1982, over 4 decades ago. It shows us that there is some considerable continuity in the tensions in the alliance. The question is, what is the way ahead? Well, the first thing I would say is that to the extent that I understand it, Europe really is on the cusp of a change. For Germany to abolish limits on the deficits that it is willing to run in order to rebuild its military, and we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars of defense expenditure, is a very big deal. For the Polish Prime Minister to talk openly, as he has, about the acquisition of nuclear weapons, even as this country's defense spending inches up to 5% of GDP, and he purchases 1,000 tanks from South Korea, is a big deal. For the French president to talk about a French nuclear umbrella over the rest of Europe and the deployment of European, including French and British forces, to Ukraine is a big deal. As of yet, Europe cannot yet defend itself. That may change. It will be enormously difficult for it to do so, but the psychological momentum is there, and many of the physical elements as well. The second thing is that although Trump is only in for 4 years, or now a bit less, the odds are that he will be replaced by a normal kind of president. Perhaps not if it is J.D. Vance. Even so, it's very difficult to imagine that the trust between the United States and our European allies will be restored in a few years or even a decade or more. I'm afraid that we have to reconcile ourselves to a fundamental rupture in the alliance. We will regret that. There have been cracks in the alliance before and crises of faith. Over German rearmament in the 1950s, the Suez Crisis, American support for European decolonization, a series of financial crises in the 1960s and 70s, the deployment of American intermediate-range nuclear forces to Europe, and more. But this feels, and I'm afraid it is, different. Most Americans have no idea how much these alliances have benefited us. They may have some notion that it is costly to deploy forces overseas, although very few realize that our allies pick up most of those costs. But they don't know about the intelligence sharing, the importance of European purchases of American military hardware, the advantages provided by European bases, and more. And although I don't entirely believe in the idea of a liberal international order, I do believe that we created after World War II an American-led international order that generally promoted free trade, liberal democratic values, and that resisted imperial projects like that of Russia in Ukraine. That order has been abandoned by the Trump administration. It has completely lost any trust by its most important allies, and that, I think, is permanent. It is new. Francis Charles de Gaulle was a very difficult partner at the best of times and was often overtly hostile to the United States. But during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, he was visited by Dean Acheson, the former Secretary of State, who came as the special representative of President Kennedy. Acheson offered to show de Gaulle the photographs of the Soviet buildup on Cuba. De Gaulle responded, "I do not need to see the photographs. The word of the President of the United States is good enough for me." The word of the President of the United States, not the word of John F. Kennedy. I could not imagine such a conversation today, and I don't think we will be able to imagine that conversation for many years to come. I very much doubt that any European leader will say such a thing in my lifetime again. That is a tragedy, no matter how few people understand it. We and our children and our grandchildren are going to be living with the consequences of that for a very long time. Thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions or continue the discussion however you like.
Well, thank you, Professor Cohen, for those opening remarks, a little sobering. I take it you believe that the break with the Trump administration is fundamental and a lot more serious, perhaps, than is even depicted in Professor Shockey's article. For folks like our group in Indiana, if you have some thoughts about this, and you've really drawn together the strings of foreign policy, national security, NATO, how do we convince people? How do people in states like Indiana learn of the importance of American alliances or of liberal values or free trade? Or, as your colleague suggested on a recent podcast, do you believe it takes a deeper crisis to bring us back around to that position?
I'm afraid it may take a deeper crisis. I think the benefits of free trade, people will learn as a really ill-advised tariff policy actually begins to affect employment, the way people live, the prices they have to pay for a car or for getting a car fixed. My wife and I just got a new car, and we were talking to the dealer about that. And he said where they are really expecting up to like a 25% hike is going to be on parts for cars, because he thought those are going to be the aspects that are going to be most sensitive to tariffs on Canada and Mexico. People will notice it in small ways if they travel to places, if they travel abroad, I think. But beyond that, I think there's a kind of educational failing. And it's one of the reasons why I think groups like this are so important. And I just think it's imperative to begin explaining to people what, the benefits of some of these alliances are, and even things that are very sensitive, like intelligence sharing. There's enough out there so you can make that case. Now, are people willing to listen? I don't really think so, unfortunately. I mean, I think most Americans, understandably, don't pay a whole lot of attention to foreign policy. I think they tend to be very focused on, the economic issues of their day-to-day lives and, other things which cut closer to home. And so NATO doesn't particularly matter. I do think, though, that one thing which I would emphasize to people is Ukraine, because the polls have pretty consistently shown that, by and large, the American people know who the good guys are here and who the bad guys here. And I think people need to be reminded. I have visited Ukraine now a number of times. I've been to the mass graves. The barbarity of the Russian invasion is extraordinary. It's just extraordinary. It is straight out of some of the darker pages of World War II. And I think people may need to be periodically reminded of that. And just say, which side you want our country to be on. And to me, and I think to most people of goodwill, that's pretty obvious. Our place does not belong with Vladimir Putin and his henchmen. And it doesn't belong with people who kidnap children and castrate prisoners and, do all the things that the Russians have been doing.
You had mentioned the warning issued by Secretary Gates many, many years ago. In retrospect, the warnings existed. Where do you think the missteps were, and why do you think his warning went unheeded for as long as it did?
So I think the main thing is that after the late 1980s, Russia did just not seem like a really credible threat to Europe. And, the first warning signs were in 2014 with the Russian, Georgia was sort of a warning sign in 2008. And, I was part of some of the diplomatic discussions about that. But it's with the occupation of Crimea and later that year of Donbass that it began to become clear what Putin's aspirations were. And even then, the fact is European leaders, and particularly the leadership of Germany, particularly Angela Merkel, who was quite popular here, unfortunately, uh, basically wanted to continue cutting deals, things like Nord Stream 2, this underwater pipeline for Russian hydrocarbons. And so the Europeans were not convinced. And on our side, we were never really willing to pull the plug on NATO. And that's why I refer to Trump as a catalyst for, feelings and attitudes that were already out there. He really is willing to pull the plug, I think. And I think the Russian invasion shook Europeans quite profoundly. And they began doing things which they had not done before, but they didn't do them with the sense of urgency that was necessary. We didn't act with the sense of urgency that was necessary either, I would say. They did a lot. I mean, most people don't know that actually Europeans have probably given more military aid to Ukraine than we have. It's close and it depends on how you count things. But I think the real shock actually was the ambush in the Oval. I mean, that was a moment everybody could see that, and Europeans were appalled. They were just appalled and terrified because that could be them, and it just not the America that they thought they knew. I mean, not the America I thought I knew. And I think that has really had a kind of second, it was a second shock after the Russian invasion itself, which has actually now galvanized a real response. I will be going over to Europe in the spring to London and Tallinn and Stockholm and Warsaw, giving a number of lectures at some major conferences. But really, one of the things I want to do is just sort of take the temperature and see if that's right. But just from the numbers you see and conversations with people from Europe and just reading the news, my sense is this, we have crossed a watershed here.
Going back in history a little bit, Professor, we heard from the realist school, and then maybe John Mearsheimer is an example of this. Kind of two arguments. One is that NATO is obsolete following the collapse of communism, as opposed to the Russian Federation as we now know it. But we've also heard arguments from those scholars that NATO expansion was the problem, that it had gotten too big or moved too far to the east. How do you address those arguments, and how did those moves contribute or not contribute to the situation NATO finds itself in today?
So, and as you might guess, I pretty firmly reject those views. First is I am a conservative, and I mean I think what we're dealing here with is some combination of revolutionaries and reactionaries. I'm a conservative. I believe if you have working institutions, you don't demolish them. You might change them, you might modify them, but if there's one thing that we know about NATO is it has given the United States an enormous amount of strength. All those American soldiers who were wounded in Iraq and Afghanistan, where did they go to? They weren't treated in the field. I mean, I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan quite a bit when I was in government. They would be no longer than 24 hours in country. They'd be going to Landstuhl, to the American military hospital there. If you look at how we move forces around the world, if you look at, a whole bunch of things that we do which protect us, it depends on NATO. And like, why would you destroy an alliance with some of the richest, most advanced countries in the world? Because, you think it's somewhat obsolete and needs reform. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And the hyper realists like Mearsheimer are very prone to that. They're basically ideologues whose minds swing on hinges. They're completely binary thinkers. And when the world doesn't quite fit their recipes, they resort to really kind of extreme solutions. So yeah, is there need to modify NATO? I agree. And to change some things, no question about it. The idea of destroying it is crazy. On the second front, it's even more pernicious. So I don't use the term NATO expansion. Countries applied to join NATO. It's not that, there was some cabal of NATO leaders who said, "Oh, this is great. Why don't we expand NATO?" It is that countries like Poland and Lithuania and the Czech Republic, which had felt the Russian boot, wanted to be part of the greatest alliance of free countries the world has ever known. And they applied to join. And it's in the North Atlantic Treaty. Countries can apply to join, and we can decide to accept them. It's also, I think, the idea that this triggered Russian invasion, somehow all our fault. Well, first, I would say, if what Putin was afraid of was NATO expansion, congratulations. Two of the most formidable militaries in Europe, the Finnish and the Swedish, have just joined NATO. And by the way, they didn't squawk about that at all. So if NATO expansion was somehow the big issue that it was supposed to be, you would expect the Russians to have something to say about that, but they don't. But more importantly, again, this is how, when you cling to theory at the expense of empirical observation, you can mislead yourself. The key to understanding the invasion of Ukraine is right out in the open. It's a paper that Vladimir Putin wrote a year before the all-out invasion, on the historical union of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples. And it makes it very clear. Ukraine is not a legitimate country. It's not a real country at all. Ukrainian is a kind of peasant dialect of Russian. It belongs to be part of the Russian state. That's it. And really what this is a project to reestablish the Russian imperial state. That is what this really is all about. And if you look at the philosophers and historians, I put scare quotes around those words, who influence him and advise him, that's what they believe. One of the Russian sayings, and they're up, they don't hide this at all, is Russia has no borders. Think about that. I mean, what country in the world goes around saying that? No, unfortunately, under President Trump. I'm saying it may be us. But by and large, one of the things that has kept the peace, broadly speaking, since 1945 is the idea that you don't change borders by force. So I completely reject the idea that this is somehow NATO's fault. I think I'll tell you what I think the real problem is. There is first that notion that Ukraine's not a real country, and doesn't deserve to have an independent existence. Is that the Ukraine was slowly and painfully creating a fairly stable and fairly stable and effective liberal democratic kind of government with more or less clean elections and, stuff that we should take for granted. And that was a threat to Russia. Because it is not a threat for Russia to have around it a bunch of regimes which are dependent and which are run by strongmen. It is a threat for Russia to have countries around it where a lot of people speak Russian, where you have the example of leaders get elected, leaders get thrown out of office, people disagree with each other in parliament. They vote for one thing, they vote for another. There's some guaranteed civil liberties, those kinds of things. And I think that's a very large part of the animus against Ukraine that you see from Moscow.
Thank you for fielding those arguments. In your context over in Europe, we've seen a German election recently. I read recently there have been protests in Hungary against the Orban leadership, and there's an election coming up there. We saw a vote in Germany on military funding, as you'd mentioned. And of course, there are protests in Georgia on kind of a regular basis. Do you have a sense, perhaps, that whatever we might call it, this authoritarian slide or the threat of the rise of the right wing in Europe has peaked? Or do you feel it's an ongoing and growing threat? Is it peaked, or is it still a threat?
I think it's ongoing, and the signs aren't good. I mean, Georgia in particular has slid. Hungary is essentially in the Russian orbit in many ways. The Russians have put a lot of effort into this. I'm now at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I retired from Hopkins after 34 years there. And here at CSIS, we just put out a large report on kind of the covert action activities of Russia, which have gone up exponentially over the last couple of years. And a lot of that is political influence. And so it includes things like support for the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD in Germany, which is on the right, but also the extreme left. The Russians have a long history of pouring money into the extreme parties. That certainly you see it in Georgia. We've seen it in Slovakia. We see some of it in Czechia. You definitely see it in Orban's Hungary. So this is a contest, and it's not. You can't tell me that anybody's winning. Part of what the Russians seek to do. There's a wonderful book by a man named Peter Pomerantsev, which I would commend to everybody. I think it's Nothing is True, Everything is Possible, which is a bit of a memoir. It's before the Ukraine war, but it's about his experiences in Moscow. Part of the purposes of what the Russians do is not to try to convince you that they're right. There's an effort to try to convince you that there's no such thing as truth. Everybody is a crook. You can't really trust anybody. I mean, the strategy is one that's essentially designed to make people passive, or just kind of permanently disgruntled. And it is, to the extent that they feed operations in the United States, which they do. I don't think the prime reason why we are where we are, but they're definitely active here. That's what they're trying to do. Just make everybody a cynic, because cynics don't say, okay, I've got to take a stand for freedom.
I believe we have a number of questions lined up for you, Professor, beginning perhaps with Jean Bruce. Jean, are you ready to unmute?
I am. Professor, my question was, is President Trump following the strategies he spelled out in his book, The Art of the Deal?
Yeah, I am not sure that Trump is a strategic thinker in that, I mean, that book is not about foreign policy. So it's not as if there's kind of a vision there of how to run things. There are the ways that he made his money, and, a lot of which he learned from people like Roy Cohn. And it involves, frankly, a lot of lying and threatening and kind of burying people with absurd claims. which he defends. I mean, he actually defends lying. You know, he views himself as a master dealer. The thing that, and you know, one level, I suppose you can't argue with the success he had as a developer, although though there are a lot of reservations you could have about it. But if you just look at the way that they've dealt with Putin, he's terrible at making deals because he keeps on giving the cards away and making concessions before you've extracted anything from somebody. I mean, he's good at browbeating weaker people, which he does, and that was part of what he did on The Apprentice. But you know, he also kind of gives away leverage that you have. So to say, well, to, you know, for anybody in the administration to say, well, you know, we're probably going to have to let the Russians hold on to Crimea. An external analyst can say that. If you're in government, you don't want to give that away at the beginning of a negotiation. Um, so you know, I think part of his success is he's been able to cultivate a reputation that he doesn't really deserve for being a master negotiator. He isn't. Henry Kissinger was a great negotiator. You know, Dean Acheson was a great negotiator. I can name a number of other people I've known who've been great international negotiators. Donald Trump is not going to get down in history as one of them.
Thank you.
Sure.
Trevor Williams has a question for you.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you, Professor Cohen. I really enjoyed this presentation a lot. I learned a lot. My question has to do with NATO and possible U.S. withdrawal. My question is with the 2003 National Defense Authorization Act that Congress passed. Do you believe that it effectively safeguards the alliance from potential executive action to U.S. withdrawal?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question, and thanks for the kind words. The president cannot abrogate the treaty. I mean, Congress would be involved, the Senate would be involved in that. But in a certain way, he doesn't have to. I mean, you know, the treaty itself was originally a very conventional kind of alliance. You know, we agree, you know, the members of this treaty agree that attack against one is an attack against all. It has no implementing part to it. As I said in my remarks, there was no staff created initially, no hard military commitments. Even Article 5 doesn't create a really hard commitment. What he could easily do is two things which would damage it almost beyond repair. First, withdraw American forces from Europe. There's nothing that commits us to having the forces there. Although, by the way, it would cost us a lot of money to pull those forces out and then to find bases for them in the United States, because at the moment, other people are paying for those bases. And what he can also do, and to some extent he's done, is said, well, yeah, there may be this thing called Article 5. I'm not going to take part in it. Or, you know, he said, I'm only going to defend countries that are spending 5% of GDP on defense, which I think is Poland will get there at some point. So he can effectively destroy it without formally abrogating it. Now that, I mean, to the extent there's any good news in all of that, the good news is that it can then, you know, presidents further down the road can rebuild it. But, you know, once something like that happens, the damage is done.
So is there any kind of consequence for breaking the treaty, or is it just, you know, oh, we don't have your trust anymore, so we're it's just a handshake almost?
You know, the thing is, trust is a really important thing. It's an important thing in all human affairs. It's, you know, no matter what our legal system is, if you know, if we don't have the kind of basic trust that allows us to walk down the street safely, thinking, you know, the people who are walking down the other side of the street aren't going to go hit me in the head because they don't like the way I look or they want my money, then you've got a problem no matter what the laws are. Well, in international affairs, it's also true. You know, people have really depended for a very long time on the notion that ultimately you can trust the United States to do the right thing. Now, you know, there's a very famous quote from Winston Churchill that you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing in the end. The only problem is they're going to try everything else first. And, to some extent, we deserve that one. Um, but if you really don't think the United States can be counted on to do to do the right thing in the end, that's very bad. One consequence I think that we're going to see from this, unfortunately, which is very serious, is that I think a lot of countries are now going to begin reconsidering decisions about nuclear weapons. I mean, honestly, if I were a Pole or a Finn or a Turk or a Czech or maybe even a German, I would want nuclear. And if those countries get nuclear weapons, a lot of other countries are going to get nuclear weapons. And that, the fact that proliferation has not happened all that much is fundamentally about the level of trust that a lot of countries have had in the United States. And, you look like you're a lot younger than I am. It won't be a good thing if you spend most of the rest of your life in a world not with 9 nuclear powers, but 20 or 30, because it just increases the chances that sooner or later somebody's going to use one of those things.
So do you see the world becoming more militarized over the next decade or two?
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think it's, a lot of this is already happening, and the Chinese are in this incredible military buildup. Most countries are increasing their defense spending. Um, but yeah, I think we're headed for a world that is less stable, um, a world in which there's probably going to be less free trade, which has been a source of tremendous prosperity for all of us. A world in which people are much more mistrustful. For a big, powerful country like the United States, we may not feel most of the effects. The people who pay the price for that are the small countries. As the Baltic states and the East European states in particular know. If you talk to a Pole, and the Pole's a big country, they have very clear memories and a very clear understanding of what happens when you're left out in the cold to deal with a much more powerful neighbor who wants to destroy you.
Larry, I believe you're next on the question list.
Well, my question was about nuclear proliferation with the U.S. withdrawing its nuclear umbrella and so forth. I think you've answered different aspects of my question. I suppose the third part of what I wanted to ask was whether with European countries perhaps being in disarray or not agreeing on who was going to share the burden of that nuclear umbrella that U.S. might not offer, might our adversaries or their adversaries be tempted to test NATO resolve with the nuclear threats, especially if U.S. has signaled reluctance to engage?
Yeah, I think, I've felt throughout the Ukraine war that Putin's threats about the use of nuclear weapons were, it was thoroughly a bluff, because there was no useful military purpose that would solve under the Biden administration. I think we would have reacted. And I think we threatened to conventionally, not with nuclear forces, which would have been devastating for them. And the Chinese didn't want it. And I think the Chinese still don't want it, because what the Chinese do not want to see happen is the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Australians and the Indonesians and the Vietnamese to get nuclear weapons. And all of those countries could if they wanted to, particularly Japan. I mean, they could do it very fast. And, I think they understand that if Russia uses a nuke on somebody, that increases the likelihood that countries around the world will draw kind of a general conclusion. With, with the United States, if the United States kind of pulls itself out of the game, I think the Russians are more likely to make those threats. You can never completely write them off. If somebody's threatening to use a weapon like that, particularly somebody like Putin, you're going to take it seriously. The challenge the Europeans have is it will be difficult for them to expand the French and British nuclear forces quickly. I mean, it's a very expensive exercise. You know, it's one thing to build a dozen crude bombs out of enriched uranium or something like that. It's another thing to have things that you can put on high velocity missiles and certainly launch from the sea. And the British and French nuclear forces are relatively small, but that's not to say it's undoable. And you know, one of the big questions the Europeans will face is, do they want to spend the money um, for nuclear forces? Um, and we'll see.
If I might have a follow-up to that, with the additional funding that would be necessary to build either a nuclear arsenal or to enhance their capabilities with other military weaponry up to the 5% that's being asked of them. What gives there? Because I was just hearing today with USAID essentially just shutting down around the world, people are struggling to figure out where some of that help is coming from. I mean, we're without programs all of a sudden, and other countries did fill some of that gap. If they're being asked to step up as the US pulls away, where will it come from?
Well, I think, you know, no, what states will do in a situation like that is they'll look after their own defenses first. And it is striking the way the British have decided to increase their defense budget even more is they're cutting their international aid budget, which was quite generous, I should say. Um, and so I think there was room to do that. But I think those are the kinds of choices people will make. There'll be trade-offs within defense budgets. If the British modernize their nuclear program they need to replace their submarines and the missiles, they've got a major upgrade. It could end up eating about 20% of their defense budget. That's a lot. So we'll see. Now, you know, what we don't know is what happens when countries really feel their backs are up against the wall, and they're willing to move more quickly than they are in peacetime and take risks that they might not normally. You might very well see them be able to do that. But at the moment, I mean, the AID thing is terrible because, you know, the administration has highlighted some of the ridiculous things they've done, and they have done ridiculous things. PEPFAR is not a ridiculous thing. PEPFAR has probably saved the lives of millions of people in Africa. A lot of the very basic public health things have been, first, as humanitarian efforts have been tremendous, but they've also bought us a lot of goodwill. And that's not inconsequential. And, it's being frittered away by, I think, people who just don't understand it and don't care about it, and are feckless.
Claire Collins, do you have a question?
Yes. My question is, well, I have about 3 or 4 and they're all interrelated. So I'm going to rattle off a few of them and then hope that you will comment on that and answer things. One of them is, do you think that Europe fully appreciates Ukraine's efforts to do more than their share of decimating as many fighting units that Russia has? And your talk has given me hope on that one. And another part is on the peace process. I haven't heard anything mentioned about the Russian assets, the financial assets that have been frozen. And I think it was around $300 billion. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's been a few months since I heard anything about that. Who holds those assets? And I just think, Russia needs to pay reparations, and those assets should go to the rebuilding of Ukraine. That's my opinion. And third part is, do you think Europe will have a seat at the table in the peace process, in the discussions for peace? At this point, I'm not even sure Ukraine has a seat at the table. It seems to be between Trump and his boss, Putin. And do you think there's a chance that toddler Trump will get so angry with the rest of the world that he will deport every ambassador to the United Nations? that's a grim view, but if you could comment on any of that.
So let me try to answer those one at a time. I think the Europeans absolutely appreciate the fight the Ukrainians are putting up. I think the intensity of that varies with proximity to Ukraine. So the Baltic states and Poland and Czech Republic, for example, all absolutely get it. By the time you get to Spain, they're supportive, but Spain is a long way away from Ukraine. But no, I think they understand it, and you can't help but admire the heroism of the Ukrainians. There are segments in each country which don't care. That's true in Germany in particular. It's also true in France. But by and large, actually, what has struck me is the degree of consensus in Europe. I think it's more impressive than the range of opinions. With regard to Russian assets, most of them are actually held, I believe, in Europe, not in the United States. So in theory, that's there. The thing that holds people back is something that often holds people back from the most extreme kinds of economic or financial sanctions, which is, are you opening up the floodgates to this happening in all kinds of other contexts? But I completely agree with you. I mean, I think it should have been done a long time ago. I think the Biden administration was edging its way there. A European seat at the table, and for that matter, a Ukrainian seat at the table. No, I mean, one of the things that's appalling about this, and I write regularly for The Atlantic, one of the things I've said that's appalling about this is, our policy was no discussion about Ukraine without Ukraine. Well, that's gone. And it is a discussion between us and the Russians without Europeans or Ukrainians present. But the Europeans and Ukrainians still get a vote. And that's why, people have drawn the analogy with Yalta in 1945, the Yalta Conference, where, an ailing FDR, a kind of much weakened Churchill and Stalin kind of are making deals, including a famous deal over Poland, which essentially doomed Poland to being under communist control. I mean, back then, the truth is that there wasn't a whole lot you could do because the Russians were going to be occupying all of Poland with the Red Army, and we weren't about to start a war with them. The difference from Yalta is that you have Ukraine that has been fighting very hard, which is in some respects very successful, and you have the Europeans. And I wouldn't, if a really bad deal was put on the table, I would not rule out the possibility that the Ukrainians, backed by the Europeans, would reject it. Because the Ukrainians, I mean, this is completely obvious, but I'll say it. This is an existential war for them. I mean, existential in a way that we Americans find very hard to imagine. I mean, existential in the sense that you think that if I lose this war, the women in my family will be raped, I'll probably be killed or essentially reduced to slave labor, or in the best case, I'll have to flee my country. We're not used to that. That isn't even, say, the experience of the South during the Civil War. It's, just a different level. And that means that they're sort of willing to fight. And I think increasingly the Europeans are thinking about how do we support these people without the Americans. Now, there are a lot of things they can't replace, but there are things that they can do, and there's leverage that they have over us to make sure that things don't simply go away. Finally, the Trump administration is willing to break lots of diplomatic norms. That's very clear. But I think at the end of the day, even Trump is, he gets grievances with particular individuals, and I think he will indulge in those. But he can also be manipulated. I mean, that's I think the other thing that people forget about him. If you look at, say, the president of Mexico, President Sheinbaum, she's actually established a reasonably good relationship with him because she knows how to talk to him much better than Justin Trudeau, who did not know how to talk to him. For that matter, the mayor of Washington, D.C., a city that Trump does not like, and that, 80% of which voted against him, they've got a sort of an okay relationship with Muriel Bowser, who is African-American woman, but who is low key, and I think has figured out how to talk to him. So there will be more crazy stuff to come. I'm absolutely convinced of it. Most of it will be crazy bad. Some of it will be crazy catastrophic. It's even conceivable some of it will be crazy okay, or even crazy good. There'll be a small minority of it. But that particular scenario, I guess I find a little bit hard to imagine.
All right, I think Denise has the next question for Professor Cohen.
Hello, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I have really enjoyed your conversation tonight. I had just a couple of thoughts. One, and I'll just lay them out and then mute myself. One, do you think that Trump, with his current policy, is indicating that, at least in his view, that the BRICS segment method, however you want to classify it, is where the up and coming, the future is going to be, as opposed to more relational, European focused policy? And then the second is, do you think that when Trump was in office the first time and started really laying down the law, European nations need to start paying their fair share, could that have been more of an impetus for Putin than perhaps we've realized?
Mhm. Um, so I don't think Trump takes a view about any international organization per se. And the BRICS are, this was a coinage, I think, by some American economists of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. He doesn't like South Africa, I mean, that's for sure. And certainly doesn't like the current government. He just kicked the ambassador out of the country, and apparently we're willing to give asylum to any Afrikaner who wants to come here. I think what he does think of the world in terms of big states. So Russia, China, India, for sure. It's not clear how he thinks about Brazil. I'm sure he couldn't stand Lula, the president of Brazil. And, since he's not Latin America focused, I've got a feeling he just has a kind of dark and possibly kind of racist view of Latin America, so he doesn't take it all that seriously. If to the extent he did, you should take Brazil quite seriously. But I think that's the main thing. He thinks in terms of big states. That doesn't mean he'll necessarily be friendly. I mean, the relationship with India is sort of okay, but some of the economic policies, including the tariffs, could end up hurting India quite a bit. I think, it's clear the Russians have long had some kind of relationship with Trump. He had business dealings there. In the course of these things, what the Russians do is they observe you and they assess you because you can never tell. We do somewhat similar things. You never can tell who this person is going to be, where they're going to end up. And I think what happened is that they, through their dealings with him in the first term, they came to a certain kind of assessment of who he is, what the personality is. And again, this is all governments do this. You do psychological profiling. I think Putin probably in particular felt that he has a grip on who Trump is and how to handle him. Now, that's not to say that he has an entirely correct view. I think one of the things that could actually disrupt their relationship is, the first time around, I don't think Trump expected to become president. He was surrounded by quite conventional figures like Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense. He was sort of feeling his way. And Putin looked like a very powerful guy. This time around, he is much more sure of himself. He has achieved a remarkable political comeback. He survived an assassination attempt, and I think that affects his mental state. he thinks of himself very much as the top dog, and he's completely surrounded by people who are only going to tell him that and only reinforce all of his instincts. So I think it's not inconceivable that actually that relationship, like most of his relationships, could go south at some point. I mean, his history is a history of broken relationships with people other than absolutely the most dedicated subordinates who've been with him forever or family members. Um, so it's not it's not a relationship that I think I would take for granted if I was Putin. I also think, Putin himself has changed. Putin is older. He's in his early 70s. He's also been living in a bubble, a real bubble during COVID, but he's also somebody who does not get to hear other people say, Vladimirovich, I think you're wrong on this one. So the chances of lots of miscalculations are actually quite high.
Betty, I think you're next with a question.
I'm trying to wrap my head around this. I, as an academic in history and global studies, I can connect with a lot of what you're saying. You're connecting a lot of dots that I hadn't yet connected. I was overseas for 15 years, three Fulbrights to the State Department, AID, UN. So I've lived all this, and I'm struggling to wrap my head around. You mentioned at one point that we're gonna, not in my lifetime will there be getting over to the other side of normalcy. Now I'm just going to say I'm 77 and I'm wondering too, my heart is weeping for changes I've seen in my lifetime. USAID was started after I was born, not too long after the Peace Corps, all of these things. And I like to wave a magic wand or even go back to 2 months, but
Yeah.
he will not be there forever, and there'll be another president. None quite like this, I hope. Did we just rebuild USAID? Did we rebuild Department of Education? Did we rebuild all these things? What? And I don't think we do, because once they're out of the budget, well, maybe we shouldn't spend the money. And oh my God, and maybe you're right. Maybe not ever again in my lifetime. And I cannot wrap my head around what I know the destruction is going to be. Really devastating. What are we? What? I know you don't want to be a crystal ball, but maybe with your profound background, none of my lifetime makes me feel pretty sad.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm honest with you, because I know, and you know, and I think all of us know, but particularly if you've lived overseas, worked overseas, what we've lost. We're just here, what we've lost, and we're just going to begin to feel it. So where are we headed? What will it look like? He's out of office. We'll have a new president. Well, and I know it's like in a marriage. Once you violated the trust in a marriage, you may keep the marriage, but there's always
Right.
going to be an element of distrust. So
So,
you're
yeah.
forgiven for 2016, but not 2024. What's going to happen? Maybe 10. Where are we going? Is it a new America? Is it a what?
So, well, there's so much to unpack there. I think the
Yeah.
first thing is to say, you know, what's going to be critical for people who have been unhappy with this administration to do, obviously the Democrats, but also, I mean, I was a Republican until 2016. And actually, for the first time around, I was one of the original, never Trump Republican types. And that party is gone. That doesn't
Yeah.
exist anymore.
Yeah.
I think, though, what's very important for everybody is to say, okay, well, why has he been so successful? And why have so many Americans thought this is a good thing? And what were the sources of the belief that a lot of government doesn't work or doesn't work the way it should? And I think you're beginning to see actually a lot of interesting reflection on some of those things. I think you're particularly getting it, even from somebody like Gavin Newsom, who's very mainstream, but um, you're getting it from some journalists, you're getting it from some politicians like Richie Torres or Josh Shapiro, Ruben Gallego, and there'll be many more, and there'll be Republicans as well and conservatives. Um, my personal reaction to this is first, I never think things were ever as good as we like to remember them being. I mean, I like you, I remember the urban riots. I remember Vietnam. When I was born, Jim Crow was the law of the land in the South. And a lot of things have changed for the better, but it's not that we have to, I wrote one article in the Atlantic called "We Need to Look at a Mirror and Not Out Through a Window." There have been a lot of dark times in the American past, in the early
That's right.
20s, the Civil War, obviously. So, and you have to look at what are the nature of the dysfunctions that helped make this possible. And there were a whole bunch. So that I think is a really critical thing. I do think the United States does have this incredible capacity for reinvention. That's that's our superpower. We are the country of people who came here to reinvent themselves. It's, what my grandparents did. It's what pretty much all immigrants do. And it's incredibly dynamic. So, I'm convinced that we will get through this in the long run. I do think there'll be a lot of wreckage around the world. I think some of the things that it would be a big mistake to try to recreate the things that are simply going to be eliminated. So, for example, having been at the State Department for a number of years, I actually, and having seen USAID operate in a number of places, I thought, actually, I think this belongs in the State Department, not as a separate agency. There are arguments on both sides of that. I would not try to recreate it as a separate agency. I don't know enough about the Department of Education to have a very firm view, but in this country, education is a local responsibility. There are a lot of the same functions that can be parceled out differently. I wouldn't. I think we should be very careful before we say we want to build it back just exactly the way it was. The challenge is going to be to build things back better, and to be selective about it and thoughtful about how we do it. I mean, I was just reading a piece before I came on about FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and they're basically all these state emergency managers say, the big problem we have with FEMA, the way FEMA worked is the processes for getting money through to the states was so convoluted that it didn't arrive in time to be useful, or it went to the wrong places because permitting and regulations, rules and stuff. If you end up with a somewhat streamlined process so you can get money to the states, which I think is where the responsibility for most disaster relief should be, all the better.
Okay, that's fine, but the deeper concern, I agree with you. It doesn't have to come back, we don't have to put the initials back on the building. But the bigger thing's gonna be, will people put the money there again? And that's gonna be
I don't
really
know. I mean,
the hits on the NIH, the Department of Education did things that the state was not doing. And the USAID was a tremendous soft power plus data collection and national security. The lifting to the least of us, yes, the good heart of the mission, but there are also things that enabled our national security. Will people be willing, will Congress be willing to put the money there again?
Frankly, all these
Regardless
things,
of where it is.
all these things were such a small part of the federal budget that
Yeah.
I kind of have a feeling that the money per se won't be the issue. You put your finger on something which I think is more worrisome. If when you go after institutions like NIH, or funding for basic scientific research, those people are mobile and they will go to other places.
Yes, they will.
And there's some kinds of capacity you'd probably be able to rebuild pretty quickly. My guess is you could rebuild some version of AID or the functions of AID pretty quickly, because a lot of it is basically about dispensing money in programs. There'll be, you'll have people who were in that line of work who might come back. You have people who do similar things. We can build certain kinds of organizations pretty quickly. Major scientific labs, I don't think you can rebuild nearly as quickly, and particularly once trust is gone. The damage that may be done to universities may be extremely severe, and if you stop growing the number of graduate students that we used to have, and that there, I think it could take a long time. No, I mean, look, my basic view is there's going to be a lot of damage here. We will recover from most of it, but I'm not sure we'll recover from all of it. But my fundamental concern is that once we get through this period, which may last for a decade or more, I don't know, and we finally stick our heads over the parapets and look around the world, it'll be a very, very different world than we knew even a few years ago. Having said all that, I will tell you one story. After 9/11, my offices are downtown Washington, D.C. This is when I was still at Hopkins. And I finally came back to the office, but, the National Guard was in the streets. You could hear the F-16s overhead. And the smoke was still coming out of the Pentagon. And my office was catty corner across from a colleague who worked in environment, basically on environment and energy issues. And his kids are a little bit younger than mine, but similar ages. And he said to me, Eliot, he said, how do I tell my kids that everything's going to be okay? And I said to him, that's the difference between us. I have never told my kids everything's going to be okay. My wife worked for 25 years at the Holocaust Museum. I have an aunt who survived Bergen-Belsen. Had an aunt, and she passed away. They know that things can be really severely not okay. And I think it's very important that we bring our children and grandchildren up to realize that we're in a world where things can become very not okay, and that we have a responsibility to be resilient when that happens, and then do what we can to fix things and improve things and move on to the next step. And I think that's kind of the attitude that we should all have.
President Ray, did you have a question?
Well, I see we've actually gotten to our witching hour here at 8:30, but I just had one quick question, then we'll maybe sign off. I'm really curious about how the United States engages other countries to help us with this process of kind of managing Russia. China. You mentioned China and India earlier. How do we engage them in a way, especially China, whom we have a somewhat adversarial relationship now, but India has kind of taken this position of neutrality. But it seems like we ought to be able to engage them in terms of kind of assisting us and kind of helping manage the Russian issue.
So I wouldn't get our hopes up. I think when the Chinese and Russians say it's a partnership without limits, I think they basically mean it. It's exploitative on both sides. If you look at the economic deals that the Chinese cut with the Russians get the worst end of the stick. There's a deep kind of undertone of racism in how they write about each other. But still, they very much see themselves standing back to back against the United States and against Western democracies. And I think the fundamental convergence in fear of democratic contagion fundamentally will keep them together. I think one of the particularly silly things that we've said is, well, we're going to try to create a wedge between them. The tin horn Talleyrands of Foggy Bottom may not realize that the way to do that is not by going public and saying, yes, we're going to split our two major opponents in the world. It turns out that's actually not how first-rate diplomats do business. But I don't think it's likely to happen. I mean, there are limits to that relationship, actually, despite what they've said. But I don't think that's going to happen. I've dealt with the Indians for a long time. They like their position in the world. They like non-alignment. They are extremely self-interested. It's actually a limitation on them. Because they're known to be so, completely in it for number one, nobody trusts them to be an ally or a supporter. And they will eventually find that that's a problem. There's something of a relationship between Trump and Modi, but they're not going to, I don't think they're going to change their policies to please us. The difference, I think, with India, this is where things like visas come in, is there is a large Indian diaspora in the United States, which is very happy here, has been very prosperous here. There's increasingly an increasing amount of economic interaction, everything from at the bottom of the scale, call centers, up to very high tech kinds of things. India has a terrific software industry, military hardware, exercises. So I think, the future lies in developing that relationship, but they're not going to play any kind of constructive role. They will do completely what they think is in their self-interest. At the moment, it's not unhelpful for them to have both us and them wanting things from them. So I think I've always felt that with India, the thing to understand is what are the limits on the relationship, and with China and the Sino-Russian relationship, to have absolutely no illusions about what you can talk them out of.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been a terrific presentation you've done for us this evening. I think we've had some great questions, and you've kind of enlightened us a bit on some of the issues around NATO and the rest of the world, and how this all plays out with Russia. So really do appreciate you taking the time to join us tonight. And if you're ever in the area, look us up and we'll take you out to lunch or buy you a coffee or something. So
I'll look forward to that. Thank you very much. I enjoyed the evening.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.